Boa tarde, aqui falando é o Mier, e hoje, pela primeira vez, eu vou fazer uma entrevista em inglês. É com muito orgulho que eu estou aqui com a professora Sarah Cleveland. Sarah Cleveland é a vice-presidenta do Comitê dos Direitos Humanos do ONU. O mesmo comitê que fez a decisão 2 semanas atrás, que o governo brasileiro precisa respeitar a candidatura do Lula, precisa deixar Lula se candidatar para a presidência da República. E eu vou conversar com ela um pouco sobre essa decisão deles agora. Então, agora eu vou trocar para inglês. Sarah, Dr. Cleveland, how are you? This is Brian speaking. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm pretty good. First of all, I'd like to ask you something. It seems like most of the cases reviewed by the UN Human Rights Committee are more related to things like torture, violence, and things like that. But this case seems a little bit unique because it's dealing with an ex-president of one of the largest nations in the world. What prompted you guys to start looking into Lula's imprisonment?
Well, a case comes before the Human Rights Committee the same way for all cases, which is that the country has to be a party to the treaty that gives us the authority to hear the case, and then an individual has to submit a case to us claiming their rights under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights have been violated. Now, you're right that most of the cases we get involve issues more related to torture or the death penalty, but we also get claims involving arbitrary detention and unfair trial proceedings, and those are the basis for Mr. Lula da Silva's claim. And his specific claim at present involves Article 25 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which protects the right of all individuals in Brazil to participate in political proceedings and elections.
Okay, and how long did you spend looking over the case, and what were some of the deciding factors that made you decide to rule in the way that you did?
Mr. Lula da Silva, I should clarify, he has a case pending before us, and then on top of that case, he requested that the committee issue what are called interim measures while his case was pending to protect his rights to political participation while his claim is pending. So the only thing that the committee has decided right now is his request for interim measures. And that involves his request that while he is in prison and while his appeals in the domestic courts in Brazil are pending, challenging the correctness of his conviction, that he should be allowed to stand for election as president, and he should have access to the media and to members of his political party in that regard. So that's the only thing that the committee has addressed at present. Sometime next year, it will actually address the underlying merits of his claim.
Okay, so now when you announced this interim decision, the Brazilian federal government said that the UN Human Rights Committee only has an advisory role in relation to Brazil. But we know that Brazil is a signatory of the second optional protocol, which seemingly would give the UNHRC some kind of legal authority over the Brazilian government on human rights cases. What is your opinion of their assessment that they don't have to abide by this decision of yours?
Well, you're exactly right, and we disagree with them on this point because, as you said, Brazil is a party to the optional protocol, which gives the Human Rights Committee authority to hear claims by individuals that Brazil has violated their rights, their human rights under the covenant. And Article 1 of that treaty obligates Brazil to comply in good faith with the individual complaint procedure that the treaty establishes. So Brazil has committed to allow the Human Rights Committee to hear such cases. And as part of that obligation, it means that Brazil is required to participate in good faith in that process. So Brazil can't take an action against Mr. Lula da Silva or another person who has a claim pending before the committee that would irreparably harm that person's rights or render their claim moot while the case is pending before the committee. And basically what interim measures say is that there's a risk that Mr. Lula da Silva's rights will be irreparably harmed while the case is pending before the committee, and therefore we have requested that Brazil take action to ensure that doesn't happen. We consider this request legally binding on Brazil as a matter of international law.
Okay, so what will happen to the Brazilian government and what will happen to the election process if they simply decide just to ignore you guys on this?
Well, if they ignore us, Mr. Lula da Silva still has his underlying case pending before us, alleging violations of his rights. And he could come back to us and request an opinion from the committee that Brazil had violated its obligations under the optional protocol by ignoring our interim measures request. So Brazil would be in violation of its international treaty obligations if it ignores the interim measures request. We ourselves are not a sanctioning or enforcement body. We don't impose, economic sanctions or something on Brazil. But depending on Brazilian domestic law, Mr. Lula da Silva might be able to bring a claim in the domestic courts that his rights under the treaty had been violated. And as I said, Brazil would be in violation of its international legal obligations with all the implications that follow from that.
Okay, what do you think would happen to the reputation of Brazil on the world stage if it just started ignoring its responsibilities to the UN?
Well, it's a very dangerous position for any country that wants to have it considered as a country that complies with human rights and the international rule of law, right? I mean, countries like Brazil ratify human rights treaties because they want to be considered human rights compliant. And I would say in particular with respect to interim measures issued by the Human Rights Committee, countries in general do comply with those. I mean, we issue interim measures asking countries not to execute people that are facing the death penalty, not to deport people to situations where they may face torture. And countries generally do comply with them, particularly countries like Brazil that care about their human rights reputation.
Okay. Would there, just out of curiosity, would there be any chance that the UNHRC could invalidate the elections if they're held without granting Lula the right to run?
We wouldn't invalidate an election. We could conclude, if the claim were brought before us, we could conclude that the process by which an election was conducted violated an individual's rights under the covenant. We have had cases like that before in which election procedures were not consistent with Article 25 of the covenant. And so that would be the way in which we would raise questions about the domestic legal process for the election. Here, the specific problem is that Mr. Lula da Silva argues that he cannot be denied the ability to stand for election if he has been wrongfully convicted. And the Human Rights Committee did recently have such a case involving the former president of Maldives, who had been, in our view, wrongfully convicted and therefore wrongfully denied the ability to participate in an election.
Okay, and what happened in that situation?
We recently issued the decision. It just happened this year. And so the Maldives have 6 months to respond to us about how they're implementing it, and we have not heard back yet.
Okay. In the case of your decision regarding Lula, people have complained, for example, that in Brazil, there are mass murderers and drug traffickers who give television interviews from behind bars. Lula's been barred of all contact with journalists. Is this something that factored into your decision in the ruling that represents a violation of his rights to run for office?
Yes, exactly. One of his claims was that he was being given extremely limited access only to his family. And therefore, one of the requests that the committee made to Brazil was that he must be given appropriate access that would allow him to stand for election while he is in prison, including access to the media and access to his political party. Now, he also asked for us to request that he be released from prison in order to participate in the election, and we did not make that request.
Why not?
Because he has been convicted in the domestic court in Brazil, and he has a challenge to that conviction pending, and the interim measures request that he submitted to us did not attempt to or seek a determination from the committee regarding his guilt or innocence, and that is not something that we would be in a position to assess at this stage anyway. And so in order to protect his political rights, which was a specific request before us, we simply asked that he be given access to his party and to the media in prison.
Okay.
And I should say,
now,
I should add the other element to the request was that he should have this access and he should be allowed to stand for election as a presidential candidate while his challenge to his conviction was pending in the domestic courts. In other words, he has appeals pending that have not been addressed. And until those appeals are addressed through fair judicial procedures, the committee requested that he should have the right to stand as a presidential candidate.
Okay. Now I know that there's a lot of things you probably cannot speak publicly about regarding Lula's case because it's an ongoing case. But what are some of the factors that prompted you to start this investigation that's ongoing? I know the ruling was an indeterminate. I'm sorry, it was a provisional ruling that he has to be allowed to run for office. But the general case that you're looking into regarding Lula's imprisonment, what are some of the factors that prompted you to decide to review it?
We don't make the decision. An individual submits a case to us, and then we have a procedure by which we register the case if it states a potential violation of the covenant. We then provide the claim and the information that the individual has submitted to the state party for their response. And then we receive a response from the individual, and then the committee will actually decide the underlying merits of the case. That process is underway, but that process is initiated by the claimant, in this case by Mr. Lula da Silva, not by us. We don't go out looking around the world for cases. So he brought the case to us, and he brought the request for interim measures to us. A request for interim measures is always an urgent procedure because the basic claim is that there's a risk of irreparable harm, in this case pending the October elections in Brazil. And so that was the reason that the committee took this action at this time.
Okay, and what kind of time frame do you have for the final ruling?
We're expecting to decide the underlying merits of his claim sometime next year.
Okay, and now just, I guess, one last question. Thanks for coming on the air today. It's been interesting. But I'm just wondering, it doesn't look like at this moment the Brazilian government is very interested in following this decision. What would happen then if they refuse? I hope they respect your decision, and a lot of Brazilians are hoping this. But if they don't respect the decision, what would happen if next year, hypothetically speaking, you rule that Lula did not receive a fair trial and that he should be immediately released from prison? How would this affect the election results in an election in which Lula wasn't allowed to run?
Well, that's the risk of irreparable harm, and that's why the committee has taken this action now, right? And as I said, if Brazil doesn't comply, then Brazil is in violation of its international legal obligations. If the committee ultimately found that Brazil had violated Mr. Lula's rights in something that had been done in the past and could not be undone, then the committee would ask Brazil to provide Mr. Lula da Silva with reparations, including compensation and ensuring his ability to stand for election as a candidate in the future, and also to take steps to ensure that violations like this did not occur in the future as a general matter. I'm speculating now because I don't know what would happen, and I don't know exactly what the committee would say, obviously, but these are the types of requests that we make to states in this kind of situation, and this is essentially what we said to the Maldives recently.
Okay, Professor Sarah Cleveland, Vice President of the UN Human Rights Committee. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us, and good luck with the work reviewing Lula's case.
Thank you very much.
Nós vivemos em tempos muito estranhos e bicudos. Nesses tempos, é muito importante que as nossas opiniões surjam e apareçam. Daí que eu acredito que a imprensa, essa imprensa que nasce da base, essa imprensa democrática, essa imprensa que se esforça para sobreviver, seja apoiada. Por isso eu apoio o 247 na sua luta por sobreviver.